Hi guys, I'm a bit late getting this video done, so I'll jump right into it with an excerpt from Chapter 1 of my new novel, Detailers, the book I wrote this past week for Author versus AI. The warning klaxon of the station's alarms was terrifyingly familiar. Chris sometimes startled awake in the middle of the night, their call echoing in his dreams even when the alarms weren't sounding in reality. At 8, he knew that the warning noise was meant to instill terror, meant to be heard. It wasn't supposed to be friendly or soothing. But that didn't make it any easier for his pained ears when they were subjected to the screams of the warnings on a frequent basis. This time, however, the alarms weren't a figment of his nightmares. His mother was suddenly there pulling at his blanket to urge him out of bed. Come on, Chris, we've got to get down to the bays. They weren't the class of passenger allowed any possessions in an emergency during the war. That was reserved for the rich folk who lived on the lower levels of the station and could pay for the extra storage. His mom only had funds enough to pay for themselves, their own bodies. Still, his mother wasn't a fool. Since the interstellar wars began, she had sewn pockets into the lining of every piece of clothing they had, with a thin layer of lead sealed in the cloth to avoid detection by the monitors. And it were multiple layers by the time they evacuated their living quarters. 2 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 3 sets of socks. He was sweating before they even left their apartment, but she told him each time he complained that it was necessary. If we ever need to escape for real, a pair of socks could save your life, she often told him. He never asked how, but he spent hours turning over the puzzle in his mind. Would they barter the socks for food? Use them to stay warm if the systems failed? He wasn't sure, but he knew better than to ask stupid questions when his mother had that crease in the middle of her forehead as she hurried him into the elevators and they were whisked sideways. The station was like a large wheel with spokes leading out from the center to the living levels on the edge of the rim. The elevators took them toward the center of the wheel in an emergency, toward the ship bays where they could escape if need be. So far, it had never come to that. Thousands of the station's residents would crowd together in the various ship bays housing the pods that would carry them to safety during a catastrophic attack. The bays, meant just for the ships and personnel, were uncomfortable and barren for anyone to spend any length of time in. When they got there, the sound of the many voices echoed loudly, and despite the late hour, returning to sleep seemed like it would be impossible. The walls were already occupied by people sitting or leaning, and so Chris and his mother pushed their way slowly through the crowds, searching for a place to at least sit down. They finally found enough of a space near the edge of the ship doors. Not the best location if it came to a hurried evacuation, but possibly not the worst. People were even leaning against the double doors that opened out into space, and Chris was glad that the 2 of them weren't. He didn't have to be an adult to respect what space could do to a frail human body. They sat down and settled in. The alarms continued, and despite the noise, Chris found his head drooping. His eyes blinked shut, then he jerked himself awake, then he drooped again. Go to sleep, Chris, his mom advised. She had her legs crossed and she pulled them back against her body, her arms around his chest. Lean against me. And even though he felt like he was too old to be cuddled like a toddler against his mother, he was too tired not to take advantage of her offer. It wasn't until later that he thought about what it must have been like for her, working 2 jobs to keep them afloat and pay for their tiny 1-room apartment, and barely able to shut her own eyes before she had to get up again and start all over. Even in the midst of attacks they suffered through regularly, she was a pillar of strength for him, giving him a place to rest. Although not for long. He was startled awake as he tumbled over. His mom had fallen, as had most of those standing or sitting in the bay. There was a rising babble of panicked sound, and people leapt to their feet and began to push against their neighbors. A scream. Someone next to them was saying, "We must have been hit. I wonder where." But his voice was lost in the crowd amid the rising wave of sound from people panicking. "Quick," Chris's mother said, pulling at his arm and trying to get her knees under her as more and more people took to their feet. "We've got to get up. I'm worried." She never finished her sentence about what she could be worried about. Maybe because it was exactly what happened. Those on their feet wanted to escape. Those still sitting were a barrier, not to mention the fact they were penned into this bay like air in an airlock. Open the door and something would change, would escape. Whether the door was the vacuum of space or the interior of the ship would depend on how long the person survived. Shouts traveled back through the crowd lightning quick. Someone had discovered the doors leading to the interior of the station were locked, so there was no getting out, no escape to the dubious safety of the living quarters. Not from here. That launched a scream or two, as well as some shoving as those behind pushed forward to check for themselves. And the panic became a wave that washed over the crowd in a herd mentality. There was no escape, so escape must be found. Chris's mom was on one knee and had pulled him upright. With a sudden shove from the people next to him, her hand was yanked away from around his arm. He stumbled but kept his feet. But when he looked up a second later, he couldn't see her. His heart began to race as he was pushed back and forth, too short against the adults to do much shoving of his own. "Mom!" he called out, his voice going high with fear. The sound was deafening, and he couldn't even hear his own voice over everyone else's. More screams, and then the echo of screams bouncing around the cold, impersonal ship's bay. He turned around as best as he could, his head whipping back and forth in his panic. No familiar faces, just mouths wide open and a living, breathing mess of humanity wildly panicking. "Mom!" he screamed. And I'll leave you all on that cliffhanger. Needless to say, Chris goes through some things as a child that leaves an impression on him once he is an adult, and the threat of war looms again. This week's book is a genre mashup that I'm very excited about. Stay tuned a little later today to find out what I mean.